Oh, good.
Okay, everyone, it's time for us to start. So again, thank you so much, Mr. Gibson, to taking the time and joining us. My name is Fernanda. I'm the CMO at I2A2. Just a brief introduction of what we do. So at I2A2, we believe that through technology and education, we can change the world. And with the support of our partners, we provide free emerging technology training for students around the world. I'm very excited to have Mr. Gibson with us. Again, he'll go through the presentation, and after that, we'll open for questions. If you don't feel comfortable asking your questions directly, feel free to send them to me on the chat, and I'll ask them for you at the end. And without further ado, Mr. Gibson, they are all yours. Thank you so much again.
All right. Well, thank you, Fernanda. It's nice to be able to join all of you today. And I guess I will talk about the fun, exciting things that I've been able to do. And to start off, I was an aeronautical engineer, graduated a long time ago, went through Navy pilot training and was a Navy fighter pilot, and then Navy test pilot. And those were the sort of qualifications that one needed to have to get selected to be a space shuttle pilot. And I was selected in the very first space shuttle astronaut class selection, which was in 1978. And it was very interesting because NASA had not selected astronauts for 9 years because the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs had completed. And then we were in the interim in between starting to fly space shuttles after having flown the last Apollo mission in 1975. So I was selected in 1978. And with that, I'll scoot in to talk about the things that I was going to show us. So see, what did I slideshow from the beginning? Okay, very good. All right, hopefully you all have a photo of the Space Shuttle Challenger launching.
Yes, we do.
On your screen. Okay, well, this was my first mission, and I flew as we called it the pilot. NASA called it.
Marco, vê só aqui o trem da 2A2, tá?
If it had been up to me, we would have called it the co-pilot, because the two pilot positions on the space shuttle are the commander and the pilot is really the co-pilot. But NASA decided no one wanted to be called co-pilot. I guess that must be demeaning or something. So it was the commander and the pilot. So I flew my first mission aboard Challenger as the co-pilot, and launches look very slow and majestic when we watch them on video. If you watch them in real life, you realize that, oh golly, they were not slow and majestic. And I'm fond of telling people that by the time the tail of the space shuttle would get up to the level of the top of this tower, we'd be over 100 miles an hour already. So certainly not slow and majestic. Now we did some interesting things on my first mission, a lot of interesting things. We launched 2 commercial communication satellites. We dropped them off at about 185 miles above the Earth. And then they were to use their booster motors to take themselves up to 22,000 miles above the Earth to a geostationary or Clark orbit. So it was exciting getting to launch satellites. By far the most exciting thing that we got to do was this. And people ask me all the time, did I ever get to go outside on a spacewalk? And I like to kid about it and say, well, no, because as a
Oh, Mr. Hoot, you are muted.
I don't know how that happened.
Yeah, I was like, suddenly it was mute.
Oh,
yeah.
my goodness. Oh,
I can hear you now.
All right. Well, sorry about that.
No, not a problem.
So Anyway, I was just starting to say one of the most exciting thing that we did on my first mission was this. We sent two of our astronauts, two of our mission specialists outside. We don't let the pilots do spacewalks. There are only two pilots, and we really want both of them to be on duty and be prepared for the re-entry and landing, of course. So I never got to do a spacewalk. It would have been very exciting, and I would have liked to have done it. No doubt you've seen this photo before. It turns out I'm the one who took this photograph. As the co-pilot, I didn't have that much to do during the spacewalk, so I was parked at the overhead windows of the space shuttle and got this photo of Bruce McCandless as he was just starting to maneuver away from the Space Shuttle Challenger. You'll notice in each of his hands, he has a controller. He has a translation controller and then an attitude or orientation controller. And he's using a rocket backpack to fly quite a ways away from the space shuttle. Okay, now what's the matter? I'm having trouble advancing my slides. What's wrong here? Well, let me try. Well, I haven't had this issue before. Okay, all right, I finally got it to work. The two spacewalkers, one at a time, of course, we didn't want to have both of them lost in space at the same time. So one at a time, they used the rocket backpack to maneuver away from Challenger out about 100 meters away from the space shuttle and then back to the space shuttle. Now, people ask me all the time, what if he ran out of fuel? What if he ran out of propellant while he was out there? What if he had an electrical failure? Well, the answer was, it wasn't quite as risky as it appears because we could fly Challenger over to them to pick them up. And we only let one of them do this particular maneuver at a time because we didn't want to be in the position of rescuing two free-flying astronauts on the mission. So only one at a time were able to fly the thing, but they both got to fly it out there. We were up on that mission for 8 days and came back, and we made the very first landing at Cape Canaveral, which of course is where the space shuttles and all of our launches have occurred from. And this was the 10th launch of a space shuttle way back in 1984. And it was the first opportunity that the weather cooperated with us that we were able to come back and make the landing at Cape Canaveral. You can see we had a T-38 chase plane, which had a television photographer in the back seat because NASA wanted live television of the approach and landing. So the chase plane joined up on us at about 25,000 feet and chased us the rest of the way down to the runway. Well, for my second crew, I was the mission commander. And this time it was a 7-person crew. My first flight had been a 5-member crew. And for my second mission, there were 7 of us. And as I mentioned, I was the mission commander. We lifted off in the Space Shuttle Columbia. And this is a photo taken of us just 2 minutes after liftoff. And we are at that time separating the solid rocket motors, the big white booster rockets that are attached to the side of the external tank. And where are we at the end of just 2 minutes? We are already 30 miles up, 30 miles out over the Atlantic Ocean, and already traveling at 3,000 miles an hour in the space of just 2 minutes. Now in this photo, it looks like we are actually going down. We certainly are not. At no time during the launch are we ever descending. We're always climbing towards our orbital altitude. And the reason it looks like we're going down is that we are following the Earth's curvature because we have to achieve a velocity of 17,500 miles an hour across the Earth, over the Earth, and not straight up. It has to be around the Earth for us to be able to orbit. So this was a 6-day mission. We also had a satellite that we were carrying on this one. And we had a number of scientific experiments that we were doing. We had a scientific payload doing materials processing in space as well. We were up for 6 days on that mission, and I was supposed to land back at Cape Canaveral once again, but the weather refused to cooperate for 3 days in a row. And it was to be a daylight landing right at daybreak if we had gone back to Cape Canaveral. But on the 3rd day, Mission Control said, well, the weather is still no go down at Cape Canaveral, so take it around the Earth one more time and land it in California. So I wound up making what was only the 2nd night landing of the space shuttle program. And so the first time I got to fly the space shuttle and perform the landing, it was an unplanned night land. And I could see that coming. I could see the possibility that if the weather wasn't good at Cape Canaveral, every other landing opportunity we had was going to be a night landing. So my co-pilot and I had trained primarily at night, because certainly if you can land it at night, you can certainly land it in the daytime. So it came off without a hitch, without any problem, once again, because we had trained so extensively for it. Well, this was January of 1986, and so sadly, 10 days after I landed, we lost the Space Shuttle Challenger and her crew. And it took us nearly 3 years to redesign, retest, recertify, and rebuild the whole entire space shuttle program. We didn't just work on the booster rockets, which had caused the Challenger accident. We worked on the orbiter itself. We worked on the fuel tank itself. And then I had been the lead astronaut on the redesign team for the solid rocket boosters. So it was decided that I should go fly them when it was time for us to start up again. So I commanded the 2nd launch when we got going again in 1988. It took us nearly 3 years to get going again. This was an all-military crew, and we were flying a top secret classified Department of Defense mission. And we lifted off on December the 2nd of 1988 aboard Atlantis this time. And we went to the highest orbit that I've flown aboard the space shuttles. It was 240 nautical miles. So about 200, and I think that came out to something like 275 statute miles over the Earth. And I can't show us really any photos of what we did because it was a classified mission. And to this day, what we were carrying was still classified. But I do have a photo that we took. We flew up, way up north over the Soviet Union, among other places. And so we took this photo over Russia of the world's largest lake. And this is Lake Baikal in Russia, in the eastern part of Russia. And what's interesting about Lake Baikal is that it is a huge lake. In fact, 1/5 of all the fresh water on Earth is in Lake Baikal. 20% of the fresh water on Earth is in Lake Baikal, because from this end of the lake to this end of the lake is 400 miles. But in addition to that, the lake is a mile deep because it is at the junction of a couple of Earth's tectonic plates. So again, 20% of all the fresh water on Earth is in Lake Baikal. This was my shortest mission. We were only up 4.5 days because I am allowed to say that we launched an intelligence satellite while we were up in space. And then the rest of it was really flight testing the space shuttle all over again. And so the idea was, let's get it up in space. let's do some testing, let's accomplish a number of things, and then let's get it right back down on the ground and inspect it and look it over. And in order to have the most flexibility on landing, I brought it back down to the dry lake bed out at Edwards Air Force Base in California. It was also because we had a number of braking and steering and rollout tests that we wanted to perform. And the lake bed gives us the biggest safety margin for doing things like that. Well, gee, just a couple of years later, I got to command the 50th launch of a space shuttle. And this was aboard the Space Shuttle Endeavour. So I was the second person to command Endeavour, which is the space shuttle that we built to replace the Challenger. And we were a science mission. We were a joint flight with the Japanese, and Japan paid for the flight itself. And the majority of the experiments that we carried were paid for, funded, and provided by Japan. We also carried the Space Lab laboratory, and this is a photo of us doing a shift change back in the Space Lab laboratory. And you can see the Space Lab gives us twice the amount of pressurized volume that we can live and work in. And we were working 24 hours a day. So I had divided my crew into the red crew and the blue crew. And while the red crew was working, blue crew would be sleeping, and then vice versa. And then we'd switch off. So what we're doing in this photo is we are doing a shift change between the red and blue crew. And you notice I'm taking notes on my notepad, writing on my notepad, not the kind of notepad that's electronic, but writing on my notepad. And what's really convenient about being weightless is when it's time to switch pages, I can just let my pen float in midair right in front of me, and then reach over and flip the page and then grab the pen from right in midair where I've left it floating. So weightlessness, once you get used to it, and once you get accustomed to what it's like, is very convenient. You'll notice down in the bottom of the picture, here's the difficult method that we use to keep ourselves in one place. Just these little foot loops on the floor. So we have these placed at all the obvious workstations that we expect to be working at. And so all you need to do is slip one foot into one of those foot loops, and you can hold yourself in position, and then you have both hands free to work with. So that works very well. This was an 8-day mission as well, and we took the first Japanese professional astronaut to space, who's here in the middle of the photo. Dr. Mamoru Mori was the first professional Japanese astronaut to go to space. Well, we were up for 8 days on that flight, and I came back to Cape Canaveral again. So this is a photo of Endeavour as I was just about to touch down back in Cape Canaveral. Well, just a couple of years later, I got selected to fly the first docking flight that a space shuttle had ever flown, and it was a docking with the Russian space station. So my crew and I trained over here to train in the Mir space station Mir simulators, and also to train in the Soyuz simulators. And we spent something like 9 days over in Russia the first time we went there. And then we went again and spent another 7 or 8 days training in Russia. And it was fairly interesting and fairly fascinating to get to see how the Russians do everything. And I'll have to say I was a little more fond of my Russian cosmonauts than I am now, ever since the mess in Ukraine got started. But I trained with 4 Russians. So in this photo, we have 6 Americans and 4 Russians. And my crew and I had to attempt to learn to speak a little bit of Russian because this was in the mid 1990s, Russia was so poor at that time that they really couldn't afford to hire English teachers or buy English textbooks. So my crew and I had to attempt to learn to speak Russian. And most of us are engineers, and so we're pretty good and pretty adapted to math and physics and science, but not necessarily to learning languages. But nevertheless, we needed to learn to speak Russian because when I launched aboard Atlantis, we had two cosmonauts on board with us, Anatoly Solovyev and Nikolai Budarin, and we carried them to orbit and dropped them off at the Russian space station, of course, after we docked with the Russian space station Mir, for them to take over the space station. And I picked up the other three who had been up there for 4 months and gave them a ride home. This was the only time that we ever did a Russian crew changeout using an American spacecraft. And this was one of those very fascinating piloting challenges that all of us pilots look forward to doing, because I needed to dock with this end of the Mir space station in a module called Crystal that had a docking port attached to it that I'll show a picture of in just a second, that the Russians had intended for their space shuttle to go to, but it never went there. They only flew their space shuttle one time in October of 1988. It circled the Earth 2 orbits and landed completely unmanned, and it never flew again. So their space shuttle never got to go do what they had intended for it to do, which was to go and shuttle supplies and things to their space station Mir. Mir has two meanings. It means world, and it also means peace in Russian. We could use a little more peace out of the Russians just right now. This was, as I mentioned, one of those really fascinating piloting challenges, because in the space shuttle, rendezvous and docking is manually flown by the commander. And so when we would close in to about 4 miles or so, the commander, he or she, would take over manual control of the space shuttle and fly it up to docking. So in this photo, I'm flying Atlantis by hand. And what I had to do was fly our docking ring, which is just visible up here in the forward part of the cargo bay. And we bought that portion of the mechanism from the Russians, and I needed to fly it up and into contact with the similar docking ring aboard the Mir space station. They told me, okay, you have to line up the centers of the 2 docking rings within 3 inches. So here we are, we're both traveling at 17,500 miles an hour, and I have to line them up within 3 inches because they aren't self-centering. So it was a 4-foot diameter ring, and I had to make sure that they are concentric when I arrive at docking. Now, we had trained very extensively for this because it was a fairly demanding and close tolerance challenge for us. And so it all came off very smoothly because we had done probably about 98 dockings in the simulator. And the more you train, the more the practice, the luckier you get. And so it all went fine. And the plan was, once we got there, for the 2 mission commanders to shake hands at the hatch. So I'm shaking hands with Russian Air Force Colonel Vladimir Dezhurov, who had been a Russian MiG pilot. And all those years that I was training to shoot him down, he was training to shoot me down. And we met at the hatch and shook hands, and the President of the United States announced that day that this handshake marks the end of the Cold War. And so I've been fond of telling everyone that would listen to me that I'm the one who ended the Cold War. But I hate to say, it maybe seems like maybe we are entering a new Cold War. Well, we were docked to the space station Mir for 5 days. And then at the end of that time, the plan was that the Russians would undock. And I'm going to go back 2 slides here, 3 slides, because before we undocked, the Russians undocked in their Soyuz capsule. Anatoly and Nikolai, who were staying behind, undocked from the station in their Soyuz capsule and moved out to the side 60 meters away so they could take this photo of us leaving. And so they undocked 15 minutes before my undocking time. And then they got into position and shot that photo. And of course, this photo as we were separating away from the Mir space station. We stayed in orbit 2 more days, getting everything prepared aboard Atlantis to go back to land. And Anatoly and Nikolai stayed in the Mir space station for another 5 months before they came back home to Russia. Now we, for re-entry aboard the space shuttle, we flew in this attitude, 40 degrees nose high. And that was so that we would point our heat shield at the air as we're re-entering. And this is a photograph of a wind tunnel model of a space shuttle in a wind tunnel simulating a re-entry. And you can see the shock wave, the magnificent shock wave that the space shuttle produces. And the temperature in that shock wave would be 9,000 degrees. So hotter than the surface of the sun. And we want a very strong shock wave because a strong shock wave is a very thick shock wave, and that keeps this 9,000 degree temperature that much farther away from the surface of the orbiter during the re-entry. And what that looked like inside, it looks like the air outside is on fire. It actually creates a plasma, a hot, glowing plasma around the orbiter that persists for 15 minutes during the re-entry. So the re-entry is pretty exciting as well as the launch is. And then once we get down to the thicker atmosphere, we are a 100-ton glider, a 230,000-pound glider. And so we have exactly 1 chance to land the thing. And so we train very, very highly for the landing task. It was always landed manually by the commander. There had never been an automatic landing of the space shuttle. And since it is so critical, we spend a lot of time training on making the landing because you can't ever afford to get behind or get confused or forget where you are at any point during the approach and landing. And then once we touch down at 235 miles per hour. And so until 1992, we only had the 4 wheels and brakes, the main gear, wheels and brakes to get stopped with. Starting in 1992, we finally added a drag parachute. And that really helped us slow down and get stopped without destroying the brakes and the wheels, bringing it to a stop. So my final slide is talking about if you've done everything correctly, you will have survived the mission most likely. And then you get to pose for cool hero photos like this one, standing in front of your big space shuttle, back on the runway, in this case, back at Cape Canaveral. So those were the slides I was going to show us. I'm going to stop sharing at this point. And I guess if we'd like to, we can do questions and answers at this point.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Mr. Gibson. That was very interesting. And maybe you can try to end this Cold War too, because I think we are needing someone to help out at this point.
We sure do. We need to figure out a way to get out of the mess that we have going on over there. So anyway. happier times.
Yes, I really appreciate. So we're gonna do 2 rounds of questions. The first one, some people submitted questions before, so I'll open up for them to start asking first. I have 4 people on my list. If I'm missing anyone, please let me know. But Ivo Peçanha, are you there? Do you want to ask your question? Maybe not. Bernardo Abreu, Giovanni Nino, and Paulo Cabral. Those are the people that I have that submitted their questions before. So I wanted to give them the chance to ask it now. Any one of them are there that want to ask the questions? Okay.
I'm here, but I don't have my questions right now. If you could read for me, I would appreciate.
Oh yeah, of course. I can get your questions and read that for you. No problem, Bernard. Okay. So here, Bernardo wanted to ask, how had you performed the risk analysis for a mission? Did you use any specific frameworks? What are the things that you were analyzing for the risk analysis for a mission?
NASA has an amazing and very extensive safety organization, and they monitor and, oh golly, almost with a microscope, every single thing that we're going to do. And so everything that goes aboard a spacecraft going to orbit has to pass a flammability evaluation. It has to pass an outgassing evaluation to make sure we're not going to get something that's going to emit any kind of fumes, or certainly any kind of toxic fumes, into the cabin atmosphere. Every bit of the mission is thoroughly analyzed with respect to staying within the trajectory that we have to be within during launch, and then the same thing with the trajectory for landing. And so we pass through a great many reviews before a mission ever gets to launch. Oh, things like the preliminary design reviews, the critical design reviews, and then along the way, we do, I guess, what I'll refer to as a commit to launch review before we're able to say we're going to go ahead and launch. There are multiple briefings in the last couple of days before the launch. And then while we're in orbit, there's a mission management team that is analyzing every little anomaly that has happened during the flight. And there are always anomalies that crop up. And so we have a very thorough, robust safety organization. And if they don't say you are go to proceed, we are not go to proceed. They can stop us at any point of the way. So it's a very strong and very robust organization. A great many engineers and other scientific sort of people that work in the safety organization at NASA to make sure that we minimize the risk. We're never going to completely eliminate the risk, obviously, but we have to minimize it and control it. Very, very great question, Bernardo. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Daniel, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Can you guys hear me well?
Yes.
So, Mr. Gibson, thank you for your time. It's been an amazing presentation, and thank you for everyone that's here. So my question for you is, how about the pressure and the stress situations? How did you handle it? Because being an astronaut has a lot of problems, and you actually described a lot of things there. And I want to know, how did you handle all this in your emotional side and also in your rational way?
Yes, great question, Daniel. And my background as a fighter pilot was a very good start in terms of being able to function in a very dynamic environment. I had over 300 carrier landings aboard a number of aircraft carriers, primarily the USS Coral Sea and the Enterprise. And then as a test pilot, I had to attend and graduate from test pilot school. And that taught us a lot of techniques for how to design a flight, how to design the testing and the evaluating that we were going to be doing. And every mission that I flew on the space shuttle, we had continued flight testing that we were doing. because it takes a great many flights to really iron out and really wring out a flying vehicle and make sure we have understood as much as we possibly could about it. Then with regards to training for a space flight, we would go through what I'll refer to as basic training. So I had 4.5 years of time within NASA. Not all of that was spent training. Much of it was spent supporting the upcoming missions and supporting the testing in support of the software verification and the hardware verification before launch. So I spent a lot of time in all of those areas. So 4.5 years before I was even assigned to my first mission. And then you're going to spend another year of dedicated training for that one mission. And then each time after that, you're going to spend another full-time year training for that particular mission. So what I'm getting around to is that by the time you actually launch, you are so very well prepared. You have had disasters given to you in the simulators, and we crash the simulators. We don't always survive a mission in the simulator, but in the course of not surviving it, you learn how to do it right, and you learn how to avoid pitfalls such as rushing. Trying to hurry a procedure is one of the best ways to destroy your day in the simulator. And so you learn to take your time, even though you're going 17,500 miles an hour. You have to force yourself to take your time and work through a procedure methodically. And by the time you are ready to launch, you have been through enough stress that you know how to handle it. And then each time you go after that, you are that much better prepared for it. So excellent question, Daniel. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you. Ivo, Cunha, your question, please.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Gibson, for your time. And I'd like to understand how, for the first time, you were a pilot, and the second time, you were the commander of the mission. So how was to deal and manage more 5, 6 people that are very qualified or high qualified, and you are now in a very complex environment and under pressure and uncertainty? How to deal with all those things?
Yes, great question, Ivo. I'd say that the progression from being a pilot or co-pilot to commander is a natural progression, and everyone that has commanded a spacecraft, just about 100% flew previously in a co-pilot position or in a second in command position. It does bring out your leadership abilities. And one of the things that I had fortunately been appointed to at NASA from the time I first got there, I had been assigned a number of leadership positions. And also my time in the Navy. As an officer, as a military officer, you are expected to be a leader. You did have leadership training, but I'd have to say the majority of the good experience that you got as a leader is what really develops you and develops your ability to be a leader. And there were certain fundamentals such as don't take anything for yourself. You are there to take care of your crew and increase their capabilities and increase their working together. And you had to work as a team. One person could not fly a space shuttle by himself or herself. You could not do it without a team, without a crew. And so you learned along the way. I was probably a pretty good commander on my first mission. I was even better on my third mission. And by the time I got to my fifth one, I hope I was a very good commander. And it's a natural progression. Experience makes all the difference in the world. And that's how you really learn how to do that. And I made a couple rules primarily because of mistakes that I made as a commander. And one of them was, if I have a particular action that I've got to do as part of an emergency procedure, for example, I'm going to have at least one more set of eyes watching every switch throw that I'm doing, because I'm going to have the opportunity to flip a switch and do something unrecoverable if I have flipped the wrong switch. And so I'm going to put my hand on the switch and say, I'm going to flip this switch. Somebody else on the crew had to look at it and say, I agree. And so that's one of the things that you learn how to do. If you're doing something really critical, something that could cause injury or death, then you want to have as many eyes watching you as you possibly can. So I had a rule that no procedure ever got done unless you had two people doing it. So that was just one of the many things that I decided as a mission commander. So great question, Evo, and the answer is you will evolve into it.
Thank you, Evo. Thank you, Mr.
so much.
Gibson. Arthur, your turn.
Yeah, I'm here. Okay. So thank you, Mr. Gibson. It was amazing, your talk. So my question is, how do you there in United States see the space science in Brazil? And how can we improve this? Because I know that we have a privileged position for launches as we are in the equator, but we don't use this because of lack of investments. And how we here in Brazil can improve this?
Well, you are in a unique position, like you mentioned, being on the equator or close to the equator, certainly for satellite launches, because a great many of them go to geostationary orbit, and so you have an advantage in terms of getting things to geostationary orbit. Where we launched from at Cape Canaveral, we were 28.5 degrees north latitude. And so when we would put, the shuttle wouldn't go into an equatorial orbit, but when we'd launch a satellite, it would have to put itself into an equatorial orbit. So it had to burn out a plane to achieve an orbit that puts it on the equator. I think the biggest challenge that your space agencies would face usually has to do with funding, usually has to do with the ability to afford the infrastructure, to have the infrastructure in place to attract launches from Brazil, for example. And so, and the only way, I think the only way to do that is to start slowly and gradually build your way up. Like I say, I think Brazil has plenty of technology. You're not hampered by engineering or science or technology at all. I'd say it's only going to be the wherewithal, the funding that it takes to establish yourselves as more of a launch position than you already are. So I think that's your biggest challenge, I have to say.
Thank you, Arthur, for the question. Carlos Eduardo, it's your turn. I know you submitted your question to me, so I'll read that. Carlos asked, in a scale from 0 to 100, how much do you believe artificial intelligence could reduce the stress of missions by automating some of the critical tasks?
Okay, scale of 0 to 100 or 1,000? Is that what you said?
100, 0 to 100.
Okay, a scale of 100. Well, automation, you've probably been watching the launches of SpaceX, and they have automated that launch and they have automated the docking. I don't honestly know what sort of backup they have, and I don't believe they have a control stick on board like we had aboard the space shuttles and like NASA have had on every other spacecraft that we've ever operated. So Mercury, Gemini, Apollo all had control sticks and astronaut control of things that are going on, especially of critical items. So, for example, the space shuttle could not do a rocket burn on its own. It had to be approved by the crew. And we would, when it was time for us to light our maneuvering engines, we would watch a countdown, and it would give us a flashing execute on the screen. And unless we hit execute, it was not allowed to do that. So we had to have a lot of training. We had to have a lot of knowledge about exactly what we were doing, because we would actually input the parameters for the burn ourselves, load it, and then when it came time, we would execute the maneuvering burn ourselves. And now the automation, as long as it's going to work right, is going to really decrease the workload and probably greatly decrease the stress. I would have to say 80 out of 100 is what could be accomplished with that sort of automation and that sort of confidence. Now there has to be lots of confidence in it, and the way we get lots of confidence in it, I'd say, is through lots of simulation and lots of stress testing of the software and the hardware itself. And if the crew is able to achieve the kind of confidence that they need to have in it, then yes, I'd say 80 out of 100 is how much you would reduce the stress that a crew is going to face.
Perfect. Thank you. Now, Paulo Roberto, desculpa.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we hear you, Paulo.
Oh, hi, Mr. Gibson. Thank you for the presentation. My question to you is back again on the risk mitigation, because you talked about all the training you guys go through and all that process. And one thing that I can't stop thinking about it is from early on missions up to today, the amount of space debris that is circulating in orbit. And it keeps me wondering, how do you guys account for that? Is there a region that you have to avoid? There is like, what is the procedure that you guys have to take? And what's your take on that moving forward with more and more launches going every single day?
Very good question, Paulo. And over the years that I was at NASA, again, I started in 1978 and I flew my first mission in 1984 and my last one in 1995. NASA evolved a great deal into, I don't know how much we could do about space debris. We certainly could worry about it. So we certainly talked about it more. And I know we did a lot of attempts to quantify what the risk was. 1 in 100,000, 1 in 10,000, that sort of thing. And looking at tracking it. And I know that we, I guess through Cheyenne Mountain, we can track everything. I don't even know how big it is. They wouldn't tell me what's the smallest object they could track. I believe it would be on the order of a baseball or a softball is within the realm of things that are in orbit that they could track. Now, another thing that goes into play in this is that space is somewhat self-cleaning below about 350 miles up, because the atmosphere doesn't suddenly end 80 miles up. We kind of define the top of the atmosphere as 80 nautical miles, but it isn't really the end of the atmosphere. That's where it primarily is so minimal that we consider it to be the end of the atmosphere, but it actually continues up quite a bit higher. So small objects that are in orbit or in space below about 300, 350 miles or so, after a period of years, are going to have enough impacts with air molecules that eventually they slow down. And once they slow down, they will deorbit. So in a way, especially below about 200 miles, space is somewhat self-cleaning because things will get deorbited. The other things that we started doing in the space shuttle, one of the things that we started doing, and this all evolved over a period of a great many years, we started flying backwards. We started flying with the tail first. And that way, if we ran into something, it doesn't hit the crew cabin first. It hits all the machinery and all the mechanisms back in the tail end of the orbiter. And the engines are back there. There's a lot of machinery back there. That's going to be a bit more forgiving than if we take a hit in the crew module, because a BB, something as small as a BB or a P going 17,500 miles an hour would devastate the crew cabin. And so NASA started paying some attention to that. Now, I left NASA before they really got the International Space Station operating. And so I don't know beyond that how much armor plating they may have done, or how much work they've put into saying, how do I harden a vehicle to be able to tolerate an impact? Because it's going to be really difficult to harden a spacecraft against something the size of a golf ball going 17,500 miles an hour. So beyond that, I don't know how we do it, except for trying to put your spacecraft in an attitude where you can put as much machinery in front of the crew as you possibly can.
Okay, great. So we have 9 minutes left. There's still 3 people on the line to ask questions. So we're going to keep going until we kind of run out of time. Bruno, you're next. Bruno Duarte.
Yeah, quick question, please. It's a great privilege making a question to an astronaut. Thank you very much, Mr. Gibson. Have you experienced some health issues during the mission or after the mission?
We have been pretty fortunate in crew health. We were pretty healthy people. The astronauts were not required to do exercise and condition training, but there was a lot of peer support for it. NASA provided a gymnasium, an astronaut gym for us to use. And so there was always someone who was willing to go running with you. And so we could go do that. So we start off quite healthy to begin with. We also trained 2 people on every crew to be what we called crew surgeons. And sometimes if we had a medical doctor on board, let's see, trying to think if we had a medical doctor on more than one of my missions. I think the only mission I flew where we actually had a medical doctor was my final mission, Dr. Ellen Baker. So she was a trained physician, but we also trained 2 crew members on the sort of things that could happen to us and that we could treat. So we learned how to start an IV. We learned how to draw blood, learned how to, heaven forbid, start a tracheotomy on someone if they were choking. That was one of the things that you could envision. And like I say, a number of the things. We had 2 large medical kits, so we carried a lot of medications. We trained to actually give injections. So I've given, I think, 3 injections of an anti-nausea medication that we would carry. So we had 2 crew members trained to be able to handle the sorts of things that we could be expected to encounter.
Thank you very much.
Great question.
Thank you. The next one's Felipe Petribu. Yeah.
Hi,
Perfect.
thanks for your time, Mr. Gibson. My question is regarding decision-making in a situation of stress. There's a lot of studies saying that it's best for the people who are closest to the problem to make the final call. And you can see that, for instance, in the military and other highly stressful organizations. What's your take on that? And if you ever experienced something like that, where you had to make a decision that differed from the main consensus?
Oh, I I don't think I ever had something where we had a flight plan that said we're going to do this, and then because of malfunctions or whatever, we had to do something different. But what I've learned over the whole course of my career was synergy really works. And the more people that you can involve in making the decision, the better off you're going to be. I know you've heard it said before, 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. It actually equals like 3 or 4 when it comes to making decisions. And so as a leader, and for example, I was chief astronaut from 1992 through 1994. And this was after 4 missions in space. But even then, I didn't think I have all the answers. I don't know all the right answers. And so I surrounded myself with my branch chiefs, and I would say, well, what do you think we ought to do? And get everyone's input. Once you have everyone's input, then make the decision. The other part of it is the more training you have had in the simulators where you had stressful situations that would get handed to you and you had to make decisions, and we had to do this in our simulations as well, where we didn't have mission control to help us with it. So the crew learns to be autonomous in the simulators. And then when we have mission control to help us with it, generally we're in even better shape. So experience in the simulators is big, and then synergy, getting as much input as you possibly can. Great question.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, last one, Rafael, for us to close this. Please ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Gibson, for inspiring so many people around the world. And my niece Valentina is one of them. I would like to know a little bit how does NASA deal with the huge amount of information and lesson learned from different missions and people involved in the projects over many generations without to lose this knowledge and move forward, create new innovations?
Wow, that's a great question. How do we keep from losing all of this? And certainly debriefing after, well, for example, after every simulator session, you had a very extensive debrief. And those things would go into the flight rules. We would try to figure out what kind of issues we could have on a particular mission and come up with a list of all the possible solutions, and then write flight rules for how we were going to handle a particular malfunction or a particular emergency, and then stick with those rules. Don't deviate from those rules. And so that gets written into a body of flight rules. The other thing that NASA was also doing, and I've taken part in this even after I retired and left the astronaut corps, and that is oral histories. They have been compiling extensive oral histories from all the experienced astronauts and the flight directors and the safety people and all, and compiling all of those, and those give us a plan in future endeavors for how to move forward by making sure that we don't lose what we've learned. Sometimes we've learned it the hard way, but learn from our mistakes. We unfortunately didn't do that all the time at NASA. So we made a mistake with the Challenger accident. I think we learned about our mistakes and we were very safe for a number of years. And then we did it all over again on the Columbia accident because there were things that we should have seen coming. With Columbia, we had warnings of, just like we had with Challenger. So do your darndest not to have to learn the hard way twice. So those are just some of the things, and I know we're just about out of time, so I kind of had to hurry a little bit, but those are some of the leading things that I would say.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
you're
you,
welcome.
Rafael.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone, we're a minute to the time, so thank you so much again for coming, for taking the time to spend with us. And Mr. Gibson, this was amazing, very inspiring to learn all about the missions, about your time. I think when we were a kid, we all dream about being astronauts, and we all, so I think it's a dream come true for all of us. So thank you so much for spending this hour with us. And thank again, everybody, for coming. And I hope you had a great end of your day.
It's been a pleasure, Fernanda. Thank you so much. And it was a dream that I got to live for 18 years. And I kept saying, am I really doing this? Well, yes, I knew I was really doing this, but I'm amazed they let me go again and again, again and again. So I enjoyed being with all of you today. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you so much.